All right, this is the adjust and refine stage, and you can spend as long on this as you want to. I had 2 hours of footage of myself painting this, and I condensed it down to about a half hour for this video. So I'm starting with the background again, just like I did when in the blocking in stage, because I know I have all those details of the branches that I'm going to put in the foreground trees. So I really want to get my sky resolved and finished in the first part of this adjusting and refine stage. So I'm adding dark and light contrasting values, and I'm also thinking about my color interactions. I'm making a very dark gray with a little bit of blue in it, to create that coolness in the sky that will contrast really nicely with the yellows and oranges of the trees and the green of the grass. So I'm thinking about my values and my color interactions, and I'm thinking a lot about contrast between light and dark, and then contrast between colors. So I'm going to take my time at this stage and really finish that sky, and then not come back to it again, except maybe to touch up some details. But especially behind the trees, I want that sky to feel finished so it dries, and then I can paint the other details on top of it. And so just take your time with this stage. I'm looking at the photo, but I'm also thinking about my composition and how I want my composition to look. Okay, so now I'm gonna start, now that the sky is finished, I'm starting with adding in some dark values and more saturation to, the background mountains. So I'm keeping them very cool and not too saturated, but a little more saturated than the sky. I'm doing kind of a purple gray here. And then I'm going to create a dark green, because that sort of back mid ground of the mountains got a little bit too light and bright. So I need to darken it up to push it back. And then the spots of yellow and orange will really pop out here. So again, just like with the sky, thinking about contrast, I'm also thinking about the space around my tree that I'm going to paint. And luckily, just how the photo lined up, there's a lot of dark shadows behind that tree. But if there wasn't, I might even just paint it darker around the tree so my tree pops. So those are those like artistic license things you can take to make your composition your own. You don't have to follow the photo exactly. You can have fun with it and create it how you want it to be. I'm adding some of the glazing liquid here, the medium, just to make my paint a little bit more transparent, because if you like some of the textures you laid out in the blocking stage, you might not want to lose it all, but I need to adjust my values, adjust my darks and lights, and add a little bit more contrast. But again, you don't want too much contrast and stuff in the background. So you're always thinking about that atmospheric perspective and trying to create a balance there between contrasting the values and the colors, but not too much contrast, because you don't want it to push forward to the eye. So I'm just mixing in some glazing medium to, make my paint a little bit more fluid. You can always just use water if you don't want to use medium. And I'm just adjusting these values and colors here. So again, like the sky, I want to get this, section that is sort of the background, or the almost the middle ground. I want to get that finished because I know I'm going to do a lot of detail in the tree. So I want everything behind the tree to be done and be able to dry so that I can paint over those small branches. So if you have anything in your painting that's detailed like that, you can just paint over it. And here you can see, so I added in all those darks, and now I'm getting ready to think about the tree in the foreground. So this is the thing that's closest to our eye in the image. So therefore it will have the most contrast, the most saturation, and the most detail, so that it's the thing that we notice, the focal point with the most detail, and it creates that atmospheric perspective by giving it that detail. So I've painted this scene a couple times. I've painted it in watercolor and acrylic now. I think I even painted it in oil one time. And I do have trouble finding the bark color, so I just experiment on the canvas, and I'm starting really light because I want to create a contrast with the background. So I want this to really pop out. So I'm giving myself like a almost white base, creating like a warm white base to really give myself a sense of it popping forward. And then I'm going to adjust the color and the contrast as I go. But I need to, I'm like thinking about how I'm going to make this tree really come forward. And for me, sometimes just putting some white, more light paint in the foreground helps, and then you can always paint over it. And now I'm adding some more color, like some brown to it, some orange with the raw umber is a nice brown. You can also mix the three primary colors to make a great brown. So that's red, yellow, and blue make a really interesting brown. And you can adjust it to like a more purple brown or a more orangey brown, as we've learned. And so here I'm just continuing to kind of come in with both darks and lights to create detail and volume in this tree. So the highlights I'm putting at the center of the tree because it's a rounded object. So that will make it appear more round to have the highlight at the part that's facing us, that's facing us the most, that's closest to us. If you think about a cylinder or a rounded object, there's a part of it that's closest to your eye. So that's why the center, I'm adding highlights, and then I'm adding shadows to the edges to make it appear more rounded, to give it that volume. And I'm coming in with these very like short, brushy brush strokes to give it texture. So I'm thinking about the texture, I'm thinking about the values, and I'm thinking about the color too. So I'm just coming in with all of those things, thinking about them, but also not getting too stressed. If I know the color's not exactly what I want, I can always adjust it. So I'm just continuing here with the darks and lights, and the light values can get lost really easily. So I'm always coming back in with my light values to kind of re-establish those lights in there. And I'm adding water and medium to really create that fluid texture so I can blend in the darks and the lights, and create that three-dimensional feeling of the tree trunk. And now there's an interesting part here. I don't know if you can exactly see it in the photo, but this is an old dead tree. It's actually since fallen down in a storm. So it has a lot of breakage to it and a lot of texture, which is why I love painting old dead trees, because I think they're so interesting. So I wanted to get this part where the trunk kind of breaks in two and there's some splitting of the wood. So I'm taking my time to paint that and all the different values and textures that are going into that part of the tree trunk. Since this is the foreground and this is the part that is in the most detail, this is the part I spent the longest on, just getting right. And you can see it, the background, the sky is all completely dry, so I can just easily paint right over it. I'm using water to keep my paint really fluid, and I'm using a small brush, and I'm, keep on reapplying paint to it. So with the small brush, that's the only thing with another reason details take longer, because there's more painting happening, but you're having to keep reloading your brush into the paint because there's not so many bristles, it doesn't hold as much paint. So this is, something to just be patient with, take your time, and, enjoy it. While I'm filming this, I will have a podcast on, I'll listen to music, I'll have something entertaining me so I can just keep going. I find if I have a podcast or an audiobook, I can paint for a lot longer. All right, now I'm going to work on the grass in the foreground. So this is the back of the paintbrush, and you can scrape into wet paint with the back of the paintbrush to create some texture, which is perfect for this kind of dying grass, this overgrown grass. So I've just put a lot of paint on there in different tones, in the greens and the yellow oranges, and I'm just scraping into wet paint with the back of my brush. You can really use any tool. Like I also have these things that you can buy in bulk at the grocery store. They're like wooden sticks. I don't know. People use them for food. I'm not a big cook, but you can just scrape into it with this. I bought these things in bulk like years ago, and I use them all the time for art stuff. So I don't think you can see it very well in the video, but it creates an extra layer of texture, and then you can go back in with a small brush and adjust that. So this is the very foreground too. It's closest to the eye, so there's going to be detail. Now I'm not going to draw every single blade of grass or paint actually every single blade of grass, because that is not fun. And if you want to do that, you can. That's just not enjoyable for me. I know some people get a lot of enjoyment out of painting every detail like that. So it's really up to you how you want to create those details. I'm doing it kind of loosely, but definitely adding more texture in there. Now here's me using my paintbrush as a maul stick to get the details of these branches in. So these branches are really delicate, and I'm just resting my big paintbrush on top of my little painting table, and then I'm using my little paintbrush to paint. So my big paintbrush is kind of where I rest my hand. In other videos, I think I've shown you how to like hold your wrist. This is just another version. This is like a very inexpensive portable drawing table that I have that you can adjust the height. So I'm leaning the brush against the top of that. You can also lean it against an easel, or the top. Some people lean it against the top of your painting. So again, with these details and the small brush, I'm reloading my brush a lot with paint, and I have a lot of medium or water mixed into the paint, and I'm just going slowly and creating this branch. Again, I'm not copying it exactly. I'm not going to do every single branch that's in the photo, but I'm just making it, I'm looking at the photo, but I'm also making it my own, if that makes sense. And since this background is dry, if I made any mistakes, I could come in with a wet paper towel or Q-tip and just wipe it off really quickly. So, you can't really mess up here, and it's all practice anyway. So I encourage you to experiment with some detailing in your painting, and painting over some of the background to really give your painting that atmospheric perspective. So some things in the foreground are super detailed like this. And again, you can spend hours doing this, or you can just experiment a little bit depending on how much time you have in your day, and it's really up to you. I spent 2 whole hours doing this part of the painting, the adjusting and refining, and I think I could still go back and do a little more because it got really dark. I could still go back and fill in the lights and add more details. But you really have to determine how much time you have, and remember that anytime you spend painting is time that you're learning, and you can take what you learned onto your next painting. I'm still going to come in with even more detail here to these hay bales. I think that's what they're called. I think they're a nice detail that I want to give more contrast to. They got kind of lost in the grass here, so I'm just adding the highlights. And this is something where you're like reestablishing your highlights. And I think I've said this a couple times that the highlights can get lost. So I'm not making this as bright as the highlights in the tree in the foreground because they're further away. So it's less saturated and less light of a value than the tree in the foreground, but it's still not all the way in the background, so I need to give it some more contrast. So I'm just, taking it slow and getting the paint where I want it to be and mixing my colors to get them, the darks and lights where I want them. And what was nice about this is there was really good contrast where you can see like the front of the hay bale and then the sides of them were like really in full sun. So that's a nice thing about taking a photo of a place that you go all the time. You can get it in the right time of day, the right weather, the right light. If it's a place where you walk a lot or drive by and can pull over and take a photo, you can try taking the same place in a lot of different lighting situations. All right, so I'm just finishing adding some light here on the top of these hay bales, and then I'll continue adding detail throughout the painting. You can see I kind of jump around sometimes. If I get frustrated or bored of one section, I'll jump around to another section. And that's just a personal preference thing. I could have finished the whole tree, but now here I am coming back to the tree, and I'm using my bigger paintbrush again as the Mahl stick, which is MAHL, I believe. And you can see I'm putting it on the top of my canvas board instead of the top of the little drawing table that I have. So you can kind of use it anyway. Just make sure if you put it on your painting itself that your painting's dry. That's important. Okay, so I'm just adding more branches here. I'm using a really small brush and I'm using a lot of paint and some really liquidy fluid paint with either water, or I'm using the glazing medium on mine, but you can do it just as easily with water. And I'm taking my time because I don't want to have to wipe it out and do it again, but you can always erase it and do it again. So I almost like hover my paintbrush over the painting a little bit and like practice. And I think it is almost good with the small detail brush that you have to keep refilling it and reloading it with paint, because it gives you time to think and look at the painting. So, take your time with this. You don't have to do a ton of detail. It's really up to you. But you can add as much as you want. And again, as much as you have time for. This is all just practice and learning. So don't stress out about making that detail perfect. I'm just using more glazing liquid here because if you find your paint is like not gliding on the canvas well, especially for these details, add more water or glazing liquid to make it easier. You're still going to have to reload the paint, but it can just go on smoother with this detail brush. It's nice to have a really smooth liquidy paint, I find. So just keep going with this as much as you want. I think the mistakes in here, like Bob Ross happy mistakes, especially with nature-based things, they're not perfect. They have a lot of texture and gnarliness. The painting the human figure is so difficult because people know when it's out of proportion. People know when something's off, but no one's going to know if this tree branch is not painted exactly the way it was. So for a lot of this, I am looking at the photo, but I'm also using my knowledge of all my years of looking at trees. Trees are one of my favorite things to paint and draw. So, and I've drawn this tree before. So I'm kind of making some of it up as I go and not being too precise with copying the photo. And I'm also thinking about my composition on my canvas individually, as individual from the photo itself. I'm not reproducing the photo, I'm making a painting based off the photo. So you can use some of your own creativity, artistic license, some of your own imagination here. And then I know this is hard to see because it's dark, but I'm just kind of unifying that branch into the tree and adding a few more dark tones and making kind of the connections where the little branches and twigs come off, you know, like thickening them up and making more sense, and then fading out the edge. Oh, it zoomed in on my sweatshirt there. Sorry about that. And now I'm going on the other side and thinking about, the connection where the branches off from the trunk is important because you want to have that look like it's part of the same tree. So, really observing what you're painting is important, and taking time to do sketches or just looking at it, if it's a place that you've been, you can take time to look at it. So I'm working on getting the connection from the branch to the tree looking the way I want it. And I always kind of fade out the end of a branch like this. So I let it like kind of trail off because it gets so thin at the end. And so I let it get light and thin as it goes to the end of the branch. And you can see this just takes time, enjoy it. I'm going to come back in with some lights because it got really dark. So I'm going to add some highlights in the center of my branches and tree trunk and bring those lights back, like reestablish my light values as we've been talking about. And that's just a process you can continue to do over and over. Also, while I'm doing this, adding texture with my brush. So I'm using an actually pretty dry paint, and I'm kind of just like laying the drier paint. So that's what I mean by dry paint, is there's no water or medium in it. And I'm kind of scumbling. You can see what I'm doing is like a dry paint technique. I don't have a ton of paint on there, and I'm kind of just like scratching it on, or doing these, we call it scumbling, so I keep on saying scumbling brush strokes, just like lightly getting some dry paint on there to add more dimension and volume. And then I'm gonna, blend in some highlights onto these bigger branches just to give them more interest. They're not one color. They're round, they're basically cylinders, so there's going to be parts that have highlights and parts that have shadows, and I'm thinking about where the branches connect to the tree, if it's on the front or the side or the back, and where we'll see that connection, just to make it more interesting and make it look like a three-dimensional object. So this part of the painting, I can go on and on, spend hours on this part, or just do it quickly and get the values down. At a certain point, you have to stop and move on to the next thing. So you certainly don't have to add this much detail to your painting, but if you have the time and you want to, it can be fun. And now this is one of the areas that I really like about this tree, where it kind of splits off and there's bark peeling. So since I came in with the lights, now while the white paint is wet, I'm coming back in with some darker tones, some browns, and adding variation in value and color to add even more interest and more dimension, more three-dimensionality in the painting. So I'm just continuing. I brought the lights back, and now I'm bringing some darks back and kind of going back and forth that way until I get it looking the way I want it, and I get all that texture and volume in there the way I want it to look. So I'm just adjusting my lights and darks. I'm adjusting my values, and while I'm doing that, I'm adding some more color balance, and I'm thinking about how my colors are all interacting, contrasting with each other, or if they're unified with each other, if they're similar colors. So I'm thinking about how all my colors are working together and interacting together. And with this tree, part of it, the colors are, the background is the sky, this gray, and part of it, the background is the green and orange. So I'm having to adjust my color interactions as the tree goes through the different background colors. Here's one more branch I want to make sure to add. So, I just step back and look at the painting. It's always good to I leave the room a lot. I like to have lots of stop for eating, snacks, go for a walk outside, stretch, and then I come back and see what looks like it's missing. And there's kind of this interesting branch that's coming off the back of the tree that's foreshortened. So I think that adds more dimension to it and more interest and fills in some of that negative space there with the sky and the tree. So again, it's up to you. I'm obviously not drawing every single little twig that's coming off of this tree. I'm just drawing the ones that give it structure, give it volume, and I'm adjusting as I go. I'm taking a break and looking at the painting and seeing how I want to complete it. And always thinking about that atmospheric perspective, like keeping the detail to the foreground and letting the background elements be less detailed, less saturated, less contrast. And I can't help myself to add one more branch here in the front. So I kind of have branches coming out of the front of the tree, the side of the tree, and the back of the tree. And when I've painted trees, that's been a good system for me because it shows the dimension of the tree. So if they're all just coming out of the side, I don't think that looks as good because it looks like it's just a flat tree. If you have the branches coming out of different sides of the tree. So I think about front, side, and back. And you can see I have the branches starting from different places around the three-dimensional surface of the tree. And that's something that if you're observing the object, you can see. And I'm adding this highlight so you can really tell where that branch is coming out of the front of the tree as opposed to the one coming out of the back or the side of the tree. So those highlights and different values can really help with the dimension too, just by showing where the branches are coming out. All right, so you can keep going with yours. You can take as long as you want to complete this adjust and refine stage, but just make sure to create that atmospheric perspective by adding some detail in the foreground to give us that sense of things being closer and more detailed. So you're really thinking about your colors and values and adjusting your color interactions and your contrast between both color and value in this painting, and thinking about that atmospheric perspective in terms of detail, saturation, contrast, all the stuff we've been talking about. All right, have fun with finishing your paintings. I can't wait to see what you create.